And now back to Evening Words with Dr. James Peterson on WURD 900 AM and 96.1 FM Philadelphia.
Welcome back to Evening Words. I'm your host, Dr. James Peterson. We are live on WURD 900 AM, 96.1 FM. Folks, I'm getting ready to nerd out, okay? My next guest, Dr. Ayana T. Hardaway, is the founder and editor-in-chief of Wildflowers and Company, publishing a restorative organization dedicated to facilitating trauma healing within and across communities through storytelling, creative expression, education, and strategic partnerships. Her groundbreaking book, which I'm making my way through right now, From Crack Mother to Wildflower, Writing to Transgress, the Sankofa Writing Method, is a critical autoethnography that explores the role of Black women-centered networks during the crack era. Dr. Hardaway, welcome to Evening Words.
Peace, Dr. Peterson. I'm so happy to be here.
Peace. Hey, listen, so I'm not supposed to get into the weeds on this show, but I got to go right into the weeds first. We're going to talk about Wildflower, and we're going to talk about the Sankofa Writing Method, but I want to tell you a quick story first, and then I want to ask you a quick question about endarkened feminist epistemology. So I love Octavia Butler. When I say I love her, I mean I love her like a literary mother. She has written books that feel to me as prescient and as prophetic as biblical verses sometimes. Literally, folks who've read her work know that I'm not being blasphemous by saying that. Just read the parable of the sower and you will see. But my favorite novel of hers, Dr. Hardaway, is Wild Seed. And I'll tell you how much I love this novel. I'll tell you how much I love this novel. And I'm afraid before we get into the endarkened feminist epistemology, maybe you can give folks a summary of Wild Seed so they can better appreciate it. But I was teaching an Afrofuturistic class, a sci-fi, black sci-fi class, and I made the mistake of assigning Wild Seed. And the reason why I was mistaken is because I love this novel. It is epic in its scope. It is the broad, sweeping, incredible black epistemology is transformative, literally, figuratively, right? It's an incredible novel and an incredible series. But Wild Seed is like the foundation of it, right? Of the patternist mythology. And I'm sorry, folks, that I'm nerding out. Dr. Hardaway will explain this better than I can. But I have Wild Seed on the syllabus. I go into class, like, ready to teach, like a 3-hour intense class, ready to teach, talk about Wild Seed. Not only did the students not read it, but they didn't feel it. They didn't, like, even those who had read it, they couldn't feel it. They couldn't connect to it. Like, this is the kind of novel that my reading experience with it was such that, like, I started to hunt down, like, original print versions of the first edition of the novel. Like, I started to study certain epistemologies to understand, to follow the breadcrumbs of Octavia Butler, to understand kind of what the genesis of it was. I bring it into a classroom, and not only, most students didn't read it, the ones who did read, they're like, it didn't connect with me. And I made a promise to myself, Dr. Hardaway. I said, I'm never going to teach Wild Seed again. It's just my own personal favorite Octavia Butler text. I know everybody loves Kindred. Kindred is dope. I know everybody loves the Parable of the Talents, so those are dope. I know everybody loves the vampire one. People love that as well. But Wild Seed. And so for me to see you engaging Wild Seed the way that you do from Crack Mother to Wildflower was like mind blown. But for our listeners who have no idea what I'm talking about, and, before we dive into other part, I do want to hear more about the feminist epistemology because I think it's really, really important to the restorative argument of your work. But maybe can you explain to folks why we love Wild Seed so much?
Absolutely, without question. And I'm so excited that you want to nerd out because I am a nerd. This is my happy place. So we are in good company with one another. So yes, darkened feminism, epistemology, all of this language, epistemology simply means the source of knowledge. And so as Black women and as Black writers, it represents the ethos of how we show up to our work. Dr. Cynthia Dillard, in terms of just theoretical conceptualizations of how we show up to our praxis and our education by considering our full selves, mind, body, and spirit. So it really just describes our ethos of how we approach our work. And so this is what endarkened epistemology means. In the context of Wild Seed, yes, Octavia Butler is known as the queen of Afrofuturism. She's known for so many great works, but Wild Seed as an origin story to the Paternus Chronology series, it is an exceptional story that talks about immortals. And so you have this story that tracks
Black immortals. Black immortals.
Black immortals. Yes. Yes. And so I did some interesting things with this because, you know, she's really, really tracking Anyanwu and Doro, and I center on Anyanwu because as a Black woman, she's an immortal and she shapeshifts to protect herself. And so my theorizing is all about this idea of remembering who we are and remembering our ancestral and intuitive and spiritual knowledge. And Octavia Butler captures this. And so some of her writing can be a little, you know, this is the beauty of speculative art. It's the beauty of speculative writing. And so, you know, it's interesting that you say that your students didn't engage with it. But when we think about just our ability to freedom dream and to reimagine what counterfutures can look like, and to reimagine, you know, the outcomes of oppression and how we navigate oppression. Octavia Butler does it so eloquently and beautifully by tracking Black and focusing on our ancestry in a way that amplifies what we were prior to the mob, right? It's just really, really important. I know Kindred, like you said, is always amplified, but it's a really, really important historical piece, and she does an exceptional job speculatively in thinking about Black women's ability to protect ourselves, to protect our families. And this is the grounds by which I conceptualize shape-shifting and darken Afrofuturist epistemology, just combining these existing methods and thinking about how we can use our writing speculatively to liberate ourselves.
That is powerful stuff. And yes, Wild Seed, top 3 or 4 novels for me, period, all time. I always keep Song of Solomon at the top, but Wild Seed is there. I'm a big fan of N.K. Jemisin as well. So her what is the Earth Shattered series, the first one in that, also really, really good. But again, we got it. Let's talk about your work a little bit more. And so I do want you to explain to our audience the Sankofa Writing Method, but maybe before you dive into that, I don't want to use terms that folks can't connect to immediately. So I think this is related. Help us to understand your sense of Afrofuturism, kind of broadly construed, because I think that might help folks to appreciate the Sankofa Writing Method in some important ways. Even though they're allegedly looking in different directions, they really are looking in multi-directions at the same time. But how do you define Afrofuturism for your work, Dr. Hardaway?
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think it's really, really important to just situate the language and the semantics that we're using. And so Afrofuturism, or Black speculative art, is what we're talking about. We're talking about a genre of art and an aesthetic, a way of reimagining Black life and reimagining Black lives and counterfutures that are progressive and that situate us in a space where we're not in opposition to or viewed through the white gaze. We're not viewed through the oppression that we've experienced. And so for me, utilizing Black speculative art and Afrofuturism as a way of resistance, it's using our writing as resistance, it's using our language in a way that allows us to reclaim our stories and take pride in our stories, and really just this idea of freedom dreaming. And so combining Afrofuturism as a creative outlet and as a pathway theoretically gives us an outlet to talk about trauma and to navigate trauma. And cultural trauma is exactly what the Sankofa Writing Method is designed to facilitate. It's designed to provide us with a way to discuss all of the shame, all of the embarrassment, all of the hurt that comes with traumatic experiences. And so it is a trauma-informed writing method that uses Black speculative concepts in order to give us a pathway. One of the other things that I do with the Sankofa Writing Method is really this idea of thinking about the infliction of harm on the bodies that we write about. So whether we're writing about ourselves or writing about ancestors or one of the things that I built into this framework is the fact that we don't talk about certain things culturally because, well, like I say in my book, mind your business. You know, there's this cultural sense of protection when we're writing about, especially with respect to Black women at the height of the crack cocaine epidemic, right? And the dominant narratives about this particular group. But I argue that we can still create space for ourselves to process our trauma while also creating space for censoring our ancestors as victims by not inflicting harm upon them through our writing as a sacred practice. And so the writing methodology blends the speculative art, it blends the history, and it blends just the enabling of us to face our trauma head on because we have to name it and we have to address it in order to get through it.
Can you share a little bit more about how censoring a community of Black women feeds the kind of healing praxis that you identified for yourself and that you identified through your work? Because I, as someone who is a huge imbiber of Black literature and who has a wife who has a book called Womb Work, who's written about communities of healing in Black women's literature, I've been privy to understanding how that has played out in literature itself, right? Like you can see these scenes across Black literature. One of the reasons why it's important to read Black lit is because even before we move into the speculative space, Black literature creates those kinds of spaces. But you're talking about taking that kind of literary practice and making it reality praxis. So talk to folks a little bit about your journey and about how these, what you might think of as fundamental literary tools, are actually important spiritual, emotional, and cultural tools in your kind of work.
Absolutely, absolutely. It's certainly a holistic approach. And so my positionality, you know, I wrote this book because my daughters needed to understand who their grandmother was, who my maternal mother was. And my mother transitioned many years ago. But, you know, one of the things that was important for me is this sort of historical recovery. And so you talk about the dominant narratives for Black women and just the stigmatization of Black women, particularly within media. And so centralizing Black women at the height of the crack cocaine epidemic is extremely important, because when we think about the dominant narratives through media, beyond literary pieces, you know, there is one dominant monolithic perception, and they're painted as monstrous, and they're painted, and we know about the myths, and we know about the crack baby myth, but these dominant narratives and societal perceptions are so insidious that they impact those of us who lived it, and I can attest to that, and this is what I wrote about, facing trauma and being really unable to fully acknowledge my mother's victimhood, even though I understood, you know, that she was suffering, but centralizing Black women in a way that really gets us to challenge these dominant narratives through our individual amplification of our lived experiences. And so I do that in the book by talking about the Black women in my life. I talk about Black women-centered networks. You know, these are West African traditions. And so thinking about our Black families and the Black family structure and the role of Black women in sustaining family and retaining the children and putting their arms around us in communities and never letting us go. And so this idea of centering Black women-centered networks and kinship care really gets to what has sustained us across generations. And I talk about this restoring of the bloodlines and making sure that, you know, in order for us to heal our trauma, it's imperative that we do so, because we have to make sure that we write the record, and we have to make sure that the truths about our mothers, you know, the Black women who suffered and their children. Okay, so those of us who were born into this world labeled as crack babies, you know, what does that mean for those of us who were navigating education, who were socialized in the 80s and the 90s?
That's right.
And so when you think about the dominant narrative for Black women, particularly in this era, you rarely hear from the children who were born during the epidemic and those of us who lived it. And so this work is really an amplification of a voice. It's a social experiment to reach a generation for those of us who were the first to witness our parents' struggle with addiction. So, you know, amplifying Black women-centered networks and really situating their experiences within the context of their historical, sociological, and cultural context is so important, because Black women who suffered from their addiction were the most socially degraded and received the fewest levels of support during the height of the era. And so it's really, really important for us to historicize this moment, but not just do that, historicize it in a way where we're reclaiming their stories. So this is where that speculative piece is really important, because the work is in the recovery. The work is in getting closer to their truth. And so my goal is for people to, you know, take this back to their families, have difficult conversations. I'm learning more about my mother every single day. And it's incredible, because this book it's a manifestation of my journey, and the journey is still continuing. So, my goal is really to help people feel encouraged to talk about all of the trauma and all the things that we typically suppress, because it is a collective state of trauma that we've endured because of this era. And so righting the wrong and creating the narrative for Black women that is true and that is real is the goal of this work.
It's so powerful too, right? Your writing is so powerful for me in many ways, but in this way particularly, like for our listeners, when you imagine what a quote unquote crackhead looks like, you might think of a Black woman who looks a certain way, something you've seen on TV, right? Or something you've seen in the film. That's what you think. That stereotype is powerful and it is sticky. What you have done through your work and through your practice is deconstruct that, right? Through a variety of different tools. I love this line in your book. You're like, I had a form. You're talking about how you kind of manage the research and the me-search, and like how even doing the work yourself, you're being re-traumatized by some of the ways in which these issues in this era have been talked about. He said, I had a formula. I would write, then I would read, then I would rest, repeat, done. I love that.
Yes.
I love that. But for folks who, again, even folks we're talking to right now, Dr. Hardaway, when they think of a crackhead, they have like, New Jack City in their minds, or, whatever those most flattened out, reductive stereotypes of Black women. By the way, folks, the iconography, and this is based on Dr. Hardaway's work, which is brilliant and powerful, but the iconography that comes to mind when you think about a crackhead is a Black woman, number one. And number two, the dehumanization and degraded image that comes to your mind is a part of this much larger arc of attempts systematically to dehumanize and degrade Black women across all representations, right? And
without question.
So folks who I want some of our listeners to step out of that paradigm, Dr. Hardaway. What can we do in the last couple of minutes that we have together to help them to understand, one, why they should read the book, but two, how do you break your mind out of an image and a sled of images that have been drilled into our consciousness for decades?
Absolutely. And this question is so important because a lot of our young people are just not aware, and it really is a knowledge gap. I mean, it's really simple for me when we think about how Black women have been reduced. And so it is us taking ownership. We have to have these conversations within our families. We have to have conversations about what's true and what's not true. We have to have conversations about the myths and the medical inaccuracies that fuel the perpetuation of these stereotypes. We have to talk about reproductive rights. We have to talk about the cases, Black women who are pregnant.
It's the Black women dying first, folks. It's the Black women dying. That's the stories you're hearing about Black women dying.
Yes. It's deep, and we have to recover them. And so it's almost, I play with this idea of history. It's really difficult to call this moment in time history because the epidemic, we think about it as this historical moment in time, but did it ever end, or is it currently a manifestation of something else? And so it's a work of recovery. It's a work where it's work that it is required of us to do in-house and internally. We need to have these conversations within our families. We need to have these conversations so that we can understand what's true and what's not true. And in my experience, this has been imperative in talking about my mother with her siblings and with family to recover her truth. And so as someone who has lived it, and I have the dominant depictions in my life, but I also have my lived experience. And so how do I get closer to my mother's truth? Who was she before she suffered from her addiction? Who was she at her core? And so this work is internal. It is individual work. We can study and we can do our own internal work and asking the questions of who our ancestors were, who were our mothers, who were they? And there is where the work begins. And this is where we face the challenge, the dominant narratives that were really designed to support the subjugation of our ancestors. And so this is why this work is important. The methodology, it is designed for people to do their own internal work. It is introspective. I provide a socio-political analysis of this era and the implications of the dominant narratives that Black women endured. But again, it's individual work, and it's really just the memory recollection, thinking about our cultural memory, telling the stories of our foremothers, telling the stories of our grandmothers, telling the stories about what it was like for them to experience what it was like losing their children during the height of this era. And so it's really just us owning these conversations, having these conversations across generations with our children, having these conversations within schools, and reclaiming that narrative. And this is where the work resides.
Dr. Hardaway, I know we were only scheduled for one segment, but do you mind if we take a quick break and come back? Because I want to talk a little bit more about the Sankofa method. We haven't had you talk about Wildflowers yet, so I want to talk about the publishing company and also just talk about the events you have coming up. So we have a few more things to talk about if you have time. Do you have time to stick with us for a little bit more?
I certainly do, yes.
Awesome. You're listening to Evening Words. I'm your host, Dr. James Peterson. We are live on WRD, 900 AM, 96.1 FM. We are talking about Octavia Butler's Wild Seed, the Sankofa Writing Method, and a host of other important aspects of how we think about, imagine, reimagine, and write about our lives and the lives of our mothers with Dr. Ayana Hardaway, who is the founder and editor-in-chief of Wildflowers and Company Publishing, a restorative organization dedicated to facilitating trauma healing within and across communities through storytelling, creative expression, education, and strategic partnerships. She's also the author of her groundbreaking book, From Crack Mother to Wildflower, Writing to Transgress, the Sankofa Writing Method. We'll be right back after these messages. Welcome back to Evening Words. I'm your host, Dr. James Peterson. We are live on WRD, 900 AM, 96.1 FM. I am deep in conversation with Dr. Ayana T. Hardaway, who is the author of the groundbreaking work, From Crack Mother to Wildflower, Writing to Transgress, the Sankofa Writing Method. Dr. Hardaway, welcome back to Evening Words.
Thank you for having me.
I want to tell you a story about my mom.
Please.
So I've had the privilege of going to Ghana multiple times over the course of my professional career, and I was able to travel to the coast of Ghana with my mother and to visit some of those castles along the coast, including Elmina and a couple of other castles. And I can remember standing in the door of no return of one of these castles. For folks are not familiar with Elmina and some of the other castles on the coast of Ghana, these are castles that served as dungeons for enslaved Africans to be held in before they were transported into transatlantic slavery. I can remember standing, and these are some cramped spaces. These are ancient, cramped spaces, but the structures have literally the blood of our ancestors in them. And I can remember standing at the door of no return, and my mom is in there. It's very emotional. I don't want to get emotional here, but it was very emotional. And there's a certain kind of light that comes through that door. And I remember, Dr. Hardaway, like literally seeing my mom in a different light through that light. Like I could see her life differently, like what she came through, like what she struggled. Like it was almost like a moment where you can like feel everything that your mom had to go through in order for your fancy butt to be standing here, right? But I was like, man, I thought that before that I thought I knew what Sankofa meant, right? But in that moment I realized, okay, this is what it is. It's not really looking back at my own history. It's like looking back at like history with a capital H in ways where you understand your own existential condition in the moment that you're in. That's how I came to define it. But I wonder if you could share with our listeners how you define Sankofa, and then let's break down some of the aspects of the Sankofa writing method for them, please.
Absolutely, absolutely. You know, this concept of Sankofa, going back to fetch it, going back to gain knowledge, that the lessons that we need, the answers, we have them. We just have to go back and get them. And spending time sitting in that, spending intentional time to recover. And so the Sankofa writing method is conceptualized in 3 phases: remember, recover, and move forward. And so what you described about feeling your connection to your mother, seeing your mother in a different light, is precisely what I am still experiencing, because the journey does not end. And so when I think about, and you mentioned getting emotional, and I will get emotional because this work is not cute. It's not supposed to be. The work of doing deep trauma healing work, it is scary. And we have to remember that fear is not real. We have to remember that our ancestors and our stories and our bloodlines are most important and have to be centered in that way so that we can honor their legacies. And it's really, really difficult work. And so one of the things that I talk about is centering our ancestors as victims prior to even beginning to do to engage in this work, and being open enough to understand the limitations of those who may have inflicted harm on us, and situating that conversation in a sense of saying, you know, I need to create space for me in feeling like a victim, but I have to take ownership of my ability to heal myself. And so the Sankofa Writing Method, again, it's conceptualized in 3 stages.
That you developed yourself. I want to make sure our audience understands this is not something you're borrowing from someone else. This is a method of writing and healing and practice that you developed and researched yourself.
That is correct. That is correct. As I was writing about, so maybe I'll take a step back. Conceptualizing this idea of rewriting my mother free was really the initial idea. I wanted to write about my mother's freedom. And throughout my healing process and working through my own trauma, reimagining her with my daughters. My mother she transitioned before my children were born. And so recreating on a page stories of my mother interacting with her grandchildren was powerful. It was powerful. And I'm a theorist and an educator. And so what I did is I tracked my experience and I conceptualized a way of writing theoretically, because I do believe that theory is a healing space. Bell Hooks is
Bell Hooks is transformative. You ain't read her, you should read her right now.
Today, please. And so writing to transgress, the etymology of the word transgress means to step over. And so this is the work that we're doing. We're using storytelling. We're using writing as a way to move forward. And so the steps of the Sankofa Writing Method is remembering to talk back. Bell Hooks emphasizes this idea of talking back as a way to fight against our oppression. It's using our voice. It's using our stories as a form of resistance. And so reminding people, do not be afraid to talk about your truth and to reclaim your stories. The second part is, excavating trauma. Again, this idea of the crack cocaine era as being taboo, particularly for those of us born in the 80s, we do not talk about our trauma because mind your business. Okay, this is just how we are conditioned and socialized.
That's right.
It is not healthy for us. And so for me, my goal is to completely shift the energy of how we feel about the crack cocaine epidemic. We're beyond that. We have to move forward. And so how do we move forward? It is urgent for us to do our work. It is urgent for us to reclaim our mothers. It is so important. And so excavating our trauma means that we face it and we name it and we do our work, period. And then it's, destroying the myth. We are, we navigate this world, we face these nonsensical myths. We know who we are. That's without question. And so continuing to destroy the myths, educating our youth so that they are aware of who they are historically, sociologically, culturally. We are mind, body, and spirit as a people. And so we need to honor that. And our knowledge systems is valid because they are. The fourth step, amplify the margin. We call it the margin because this is how we're positioned within social constructs. I won't do a whole sociological thing, but amplifying the margin. And so in the book, I amplify role of Black women as caregivers and really taking these gritty stories and these messy stories and finding the beauty and the joy that describes who we are as a people. We are resilient and we are incredible. And so we need to remember who we are. The final step, Go Free Wildflower, is my conceptualization of rewriting my mother's story. And so what would her life look like if she was still here? What would her life look like if she could have a conversation with her granddaughters? What does it look like to give her voice? What does it look like to paint her body in a way as a canvas, in a way that retains her beauty and retains her personality traits? And so all of the work that you're doing throughout the methodology, you're reclaiming their stories, you're excavating and you're digging for the bits and pieces of their truth, and then you recreate them in a speculative way so that you can create counterfutures, but you're restoring your bloodline and it facilitates the healing process.
So powerful. So powerful.
I get really excited.
The work is exciting, Doc, and the chat on the Facebook thread is blowing up. So many questions, but I'll give you one to answer here. This is Zen from Facebook saying, I'm trying to understand drug addiction. Is it a social thing, or is it lacking in a life that causes one to do this to themselves? What they're looking for, some root causes for drug addiction.
Zen, I'm so glad that you talked about this. So in chapter 5, I talk about the neurology. I talk about the brain. And one of my, as an educator, I'm someone that is always going to bring the knowledge back. And so, we should not have to have a medical degree to understand how our brains and our cognition works. And so it was really important for me when I was in consult with my Black woman therapist who specialized in chronic conditions. I was very intentional about who I selected when I needed to do my work. And so she was explaining the neurological pathways. She was explaining what happens to the brain when these types of narcotics are ingested, so that it made me understand my mother's addiction. So all of the things that I experienced as a child, and the behaviors, I didn't understand my mother's behaviors in the context of her truth, which was that she was suffering neurologically, brain damage. And so I talk a lot about the brain, and I talk a lot about what was actually happening, so that once you understand their truths, you can't unsee it. You cannot unsee it. And so my goal was to excavate as deep as I can, to bring this information in a way that is palatable and and relatable, to provide context for addiction. Addiction is it is a chronic illness, and the level of inaccuracies medically, I think it is underexplored. I think that this era, there's been lots of apologies from the media, but it is insufficient, with a capital I and a capital T at the end. Academics, Black academics, particularly those of us who were born during this era, we have work to do. So my call of action is for healing, but it is also to reclaim what transpired, and thinking about our cultural memory. We have to reconcile what we experienced with what we were told was true, and none of it is true. And so, this work, it is imperative for us to take a step back and to look at this thing holistically. But in the meantime, we will heal. In the meantime, we will educate ourselves. And that is my goal as a scholar, as a practitioner. Wildflowers Co. When I thought about if my mother was here, what would she say? If my mother was here and women like my mother, what would they say? And Wildflowers Co. is designed, it was conceptualized, it was built on that idea. Where can we house marginalized stories? Where can we amplify our truths? And so this organization is dedicated towards facilitating trauma healing. This is what we do. We're amplifying the beauty of our experiences. I'm really excited about our partnerships. We are having a couple of events coming up.
Yes, please. We only have a couple minutes left. Please, let's talk about the events before my producer comes in here and says, "What are you doing, dude? Your people can come see you." Let's talk about that for a minute, please.
Yes. So we are starting on Friday at Black Friday. We will be at the Willow Grove Mall, promoting the book, Wildflowers Co. and the Sankofa Writing Method. So please come to see us in the Macy's Court. We will be there all day from 8 to 5. Beautiful. On Saturday. I am so excited to share that we are partnering with the Philadelphia Community Youth Court, and we will be at the Braid Mill for a free event called Poetry and Storytelling as Resistance. We will be talking about Black culture. We will be talking about our healing, and we will be doing it in community with our young people. So we will be at the Braid Mill, 441 High Street, unit number 7. So please come out and see us. I'm also having a private event on Sunday where we are engaging with local partners. We'll be inviting educators, policymakers to learn more about what we're doing. And we will also be announcing our partnership with the United States District of Pennsylvania's Reentry to Aid Supervision Program. We are going to be working with reentry participants and utilizing this method so that we can begin to do the necessary work of healing and amplifying our truths. So we're really excited about our work. We're really excited about all the events. If you can't come out to any of the events, you can find me online at AyanaTHardaway.com, Ayana T. Hardaway on social media. And I'm so excited to meet everyone. And I'm grateful for the levels of support that I've received from my Philadelphia family, and just educators and community members for the work that we're going to be doing. It's incredible, and I'm excited.
Dr. Hardaway, your work is absolutely vital. Your work is absolutely vital for our community in a number of different ways, and I hope we've been able to elucidate some of those ways in this brief conversation. But I'll mention this to Terry as well. I want to make sure that we find some ways to get you back on Evening Words to talk
Absolutely.
more about your work, continue this conversation, think together a little bit more about how we get your important work out to the community in ways that they can apply it to their own lives. Just absolutely vital work from you, Dr. Hardaway. Congrats on the book, and good luck with the tour and getting the word out to the community.
Absolutely. And thank you so much for having me. And thank you so much to all the WURD listeners. I'm so excited. And it really is an honor to be here to speak with you about this work and to speak to this audience about this work. I'm from Philly, North Philly, and being able to bring this work home in a way that's going to be transformational is incredible. And I'm really excited about the work that we will do collectively.
Thank you so much for your time. Thank you for staying for an extra segment so we could go a little bit deeper. I appreciate it, and I'm serious. Let's get you back on here as soon as we can.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
Thank you. You're listening to Evening Words. I'm your host, Dr. James Peterson. We are live on WRD, 900 AM, 96.1 FM. Wow, what an exceptional scholar, researcher, and practitioner we have in Dr. Ayana T. Hardaway, who is the founder and editor-in-chief of Wildflowers Company, publishing a restorative organization dedicated to facilitating trauma healing within and across communities through storytelling, creative expression, education, and strategic partnerships. Her groundbreaking work, From Crack Mother to Wildflower, Writing to Transgress, the Sankofa Writing Method, is a critical autoethnography that explores the role of Black women-centered networks during the crack era. It is a fascinating read, and as I mentioned to you all in my outro for Dr. Hardaway, it is vital work for our community in these critical times. You can check her out at the Willow Grove Mall on Black Friday, Philadelphia Youth Courts, I believe, on Saturday, private event on Sunday. But go to Dr. Ayana T. Hardaway. Just Google her. Her website will come right up, and the full list of schedules will be right there. We will make sure we have her back on these airwaves, and we'll be right back after these messages.